For Allison, silence had become both a comfort and a punishment. She lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Boston, Massachusetts, on the top floor of a converted brownstone building. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television, or the occasional argument muffled through plaster and paint, but when midnight came, the world outside seemed to sink into stillness. That stillness pressed against her chest, reminding her of everything she had lost. Allison was 26, but she often felt older, as if heartbreak had aged her by decades. Just 6 months earlier, her world had cracked open in ways she hadn't thought possible. She had once believed love was an anchor, something to steady her through the storms of adulthood. But when David left, it felt like he had ripped that anchor away, sending her adrift into uncharted waters. David had been more than a boyfriend. He was her college sweetheart, her co-conspirator in late-night adventures, the man she thought she would marry. They had met at Northeastern University, both sitting in a cramped classroom for a sociology elective they neither of them really wanted to take. He had leaned over her desk one afternoon to borrow a pen, flashing a grin that lit up his hazel eyes. That was the start of everything. For 8 years, they built a life together, a shared rhythm of morning coffees, quiet Sunday walks along the Charles River, road trips with music loud enough to drown out the world. And then one ordinary Thursday, it was over. She could still see the way he had stood in the doorway of their apartment, suitcase in hand, his shoulders slumped under invisible weight. His words had been simple, almost mechanical, "I can't do this anymore. I need to figure out who I am." No dramatic fight, no betrayal uncovered, just a quiet unraveling of promises. He had kissed her on the forehead like she was a stranger he pitied, and then the door clicked shut. She hadn't heard from him since. The silence after midnight reminded her of that door. Allison's friends tried to pull her out of the grief. They invited her to bars, to trivia nights, to rooftop parties when summer stretched its golden arms across the city. She went, sometimes. She laughed, sometimes. But the laughter always felt like glass in her throat. People said time healed, but time seemed to mock her instead. 6 months, and she still couldn't walk past the cafe where she and David had spent their Saturdays without feeling like her ribs might crack. So she built new rituals. At 12:05 a.m., she would make chamomile tea, standing barefoot on the cool linoleum of her kitchen. At 12:10, she would sit by the window with her notebook, writing down thoughts she was too embarrassed to say aloud. Sometimes they were only fragments, "Why wasn't I enough?" or "What if he never comes back?" Other times, whole pages spilled out, filled with questions about the nature of love and loss, about whether she even knew who she was without David's shadow beside her. She never let anyone read those words. One night in September, the silence pressed harder than usual. The city air had cooled, carrying hints of autumn, burnt leaves, distant wood smoke, the sharpness of change. Allison sat curled on the window ledge, notebook open, pen in hand, when her phone buzzed. For a split second, her heart leapt. She imagined his name glowing on the screen, imagined him saying he was sorry, that he'd been lost but had found his way back. But it wasn't David. It was her younger sister, Claire. Claire lived in Chicago, chasing her dream of becoming a journalist. She was only 23 but carried herself with the confidence of someone older. Allison loved her fiercely, though sometimes she felt like the younger sibling in their dynamic. Claire's text read. "Hey, thinking of visiting you next weekend. You free?" Allison hesitated before replying. She wasn't sure she wanted company. Grief had made her selfish in ways she didn't recognize, hoarding her pain like it was the only thing she had left of him. But she also knew Claire's presence might force her to breathe again. "Yes. Come, she typed back. And for the first time in months, Allison felt the faintest tremor of anticipation. The days leading up to Claire's visit were a blur of half-hearted cleaning and restless pacing. Allison hadn't realized how much she had let her apartment slip into disarray until she started picking up coffee mugs from the windowsill, or shaking out the blanket that had become her permanent cocoon on the couch. She scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed, as though erasing crumbs could somehow erase the months of loneliness. On Friday evening, Claire arrived with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a smile that seemed to cut straight through Allison's defenses. She hugged her sister tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender shampoo and the faint tang of airplane air. "God, you look skinny," Claire said, pulling back to examine her. "Are you eating properly?" Allison rolled her eyes, though her throat tightened at the concern. "Nice to see you too." They fell into their old rhythm easily, cooking dinner together, pasta tossed with garlic, olive oil, and a generous shower of parmesan. Claire filled the silence with stories about her newsroom, about deadlines and interviews, about the chaos of living in a city that never seemed to pause. Allison listened, grateful for the noise. Later that night, they sat on the couch with glasses of wine. The city outside pulsed with weekend energy, but inside the apartment, it was warm and safe. "So," Claire said gently, tucking her legs under her. "How are you really doing?" The question cracked something open. Allison hadn't cried in weeks, at least not in front of anyone, but suddenly tears burned her eyes. She pressed the wine glass against her lips, trying to hide the tremor in her mouth. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she whispered. "Like he took the best parts of me with him." Claire reached over, taking her hand. "No, Al. He didn't take them. They're still here. You just forgot where to look." Allison wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that beneath the rubble of her heartbreak, something of herself remained. But in that moment, all she felt was the hollow ache of absence. Still, having Claire beside her softened the silence. That night, when the apartment finally settled into stillness, Allison sat at her desk with her notebook. Her sister's words echoed in her head, *, they're still here. You just forgot where to look, *. For the first time in months, her writing shifted. Instead of questions about David, she wrote about herself. She wrote about the girl who used to love running along the esplanade at sunrise, about the way her hands itched to paint even though she hadn't picked up a brush in years, about the stubborn streak that had once carried her across the country for an internship in San Francisco. She wrote about the fragments of identity that existed before him. As she filled the page, the silence after midnight didn't feel quite as suffocating. It felt, for a moment, like possibility. She didn't know then that this was the beginning of something larger, that heartbreak was not the end of her story, but the painful opening chapter of a new one. For now, she only knew that when dawn crept over Boston, she felt just a little less broken. And sometimes, that was enough.